The courtroom went silent when the bailiff called Daniel Harris's name, and the silence didn't feel neutral. It felt loaded, like a verdict had already been whispered somewhere behind closed doors. Daniel stood slowly, the wooden bench creaking beneath him. His hands were rough grease still trapped under his fingernails, no matter how hard he scrubbed them that morning. He could feel eyes on his back as he stepped forward. Not curious eyes, measuring ones, the kind that decide your worth before you open your mouth. Across the aisle, Laura Harris sat perfectly still. Her coat was neatly pressed, her hair smooth, her posture practiced. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't have to. Her attorney leaned in and murmured something, and she nodded once, tight and confident, like someone who had already rehearsed the ending. Daniel swallowed. The air in the courtroom felt dry, stale, heavy with old wood and older judgments. Somewhere behind him a woman coughed. Papers rustled. A clock ticked too loudly. 3 days. That was all he had been thinking about since the letter arrived. 3 days until a stranger in a black robe would decide whether his daughter slept in the same narrow bedroom she had grown up in, or whether her life would be boxed up and carried somewhere else by people who called it stability. Daniel had been underestimated his entire life. He had learned to recognize the signs. The quick scan of his jacket, the pause on his worn boots, the way professionals softened their voices when they talked to him, as if lowering expectations was a form of kindness. The judge had not entered yet. The bench stood empty, elevated, waiting. Daniel stared at it anyway. He imagined a silhouette there, faceless, weighty, unmoved. He wondered what that person would see when they looked down at him. A man who worked too much. A man who earned too little. A man who should know his limits. Daniel thought of Sophie. She was 7, but she had learned how to read faces early. Too early. She knew when money was tight by the way Daniel counted bills at the kitchen table. She knew when he was exhausted by the way his shoulders sagged when he came home after dark. She had stopped asking for toys. She asked instead if they could watch another episode, or if he could sit with her a little longer. That morning, she had watched him tie his tie in the bathroom mirror. It was an old tie, borrowed from his neighbor, the knot slightly uneven. Sophie stood in the doorway, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. Daniel had smiled. He always smiled for her. "I'll be fine, kiddo." She tilted her head. "You say that when you're not fine." The memory hit him now sharp and unwelcome. Daniel clenched his jaw, grounding himself in the present. The courtroom, the bench, the stakes. Laura's attorney stood and cleared his throat, already warming up for arguments that would paint Daniel as a risk. Not dangerous, just insufficient. The worst kind of accusation, because it sounded reasonable. Before he could speak, the side door opened. Everyone stood. Daniel rose with the rest, his pulse thudding in his ears. The judge entered, robes flowing, expression unreadable. He was tall, silver-haired, his movements controlled and deliberate. He took his seat without looking at either party, arranging his papers with careful precision. Judge Thomas Whitman. The name had meant nothing to Daniel when he read it on the notice. It meant nothing now. Just another man with the power to decide things Daniel could not afford to lose. "Be seated," the judge said. His voice was calm, neutral, trained. Daniel sat. As the judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file, Daniel felt something shift. Not in the room, in himself, a pressure behind his ribs. A tightening instinct he didn't fully understand. Judge Whitman's eyes moved across the page, then lifted, scanning the room. They paused briefly on Laura, then on Daniel. It was nothing, a fraction of a second. But something in the judge's expression flickered, gone as quickly as it appeared. Daniel told himself he was imagining it. He had been imagining hope lately too, and that was dangerous. The judge called the case. Names were read aloud. The formal language washed over Daniel, half absorbed. He focused instead on the small sounds, the scratch of a pen, the hum of fluorescent lights. Laura's heel tapping once, then stopping. As arguments began, Daniel felt the familiar frustration build. Laura's attorney spoke smoothly about consistency opportunity resources. He spoke of better schools, quieter neighborhoods, flexibility. He spoke as if love were a line item, and Daniel felt his hands curl into fists beneath the table. When it was Daniel's turn, his public defender rose. A decent man, overworked, careful with his words. He's been the primary caregiver, the defender said. He has never missed a medical appointment, never missed a parent-teacher conference. His income is limited. Yes, but limited income is relevant. Laura's attorney cut in. Daniel's chest tightened. The judge raised a hand. Silence fell again. Daniel looked up. For the first time, Judge Whitman looked directly at him. Not past him, not through him, at him. The judge's gaze was sharp, assessing. It lingered a beat longer than Daniel expected. Daniel didn't know why, but his mind flashed to a rain-soaked highway, to hazard lights blinking amber against black asphalt, to two young women standing beside a car, hair plastered to their faces, eyes tired but steady. He shook the thought away. This was not the moment for distractions. The judge spoke again, measured. Before we proceed further, the court will take a brief recess. A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel's attorney turned toward him, frowning. Laura's attorney stiffened, clearly displeased. Laura finally looked at Daniel, then her eyes sharp, searching his face for something she could use. Daniel had no idea what was happening. His heart pounded anyway. As everyone stood, Judge Whitman gathered his files and rose. Just before he turned toward the door, his eyes met Daniel's one last time. This time there was no flicker. There was recognition. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face, though he didn't yet know why. He only knew that something had shifted beneath the surface of this room. Something heavy. Something that would not stay buried. And somewhere far from the courthouse, a little girl sat on a couch with a rabbit in her arms, waiting for a promise she hoped would still be true. Rain had a way of flattening the world, turning everything into reflections and noise. And Daniel Harris remembered that night more clearly than the courtroom itself. The highway had been nearly empty, the kind of stretch locals used only when they wanted to shave time off a drive or avoid the town lights. Daniel's headlights cut through sheets of rain, the wipers dragging back and forth in a tired rhythm. His hands ached from a double shift at the garage. His back burned. The radio murmured static he didn't bother fixing. All he wanted was home, a microwaved dinner, and Sophie asleep on the couch with the television still on. Then the hazard lights appeared. Two pulses of amber, blinking out of the dark, parked crooked on the shoulder. Daniel slowed without meaning to. He told himself it was habit that he always checked the shoulder. He told himself it wasn't guilt that made his foot ease off the gas. As he drew closer, he saw them. Two women standing just beyond the glow of the tail lights. Same height, same posture. Hair soaked and plastered to their coats. One held a phone up toward the sky, like it might catch a signal if she begged hard enough. Daniel drove past them. He told himself it was smarter. He told himself he had no jumper cables. He told himself he couldn't afford trouble. His chest tightened anyway. He pictured Sophie at 18 or 19 or 20, standing in the rain, somewhere waiting for a stranger to decide whether she mattered. Daniel cursed under his breath and eased the car onto the shoulder. The engine idled roughly as he stepped out into the rain. It soaked through his jacket in seconds. He didn't bother pulling the hood up. The women turned toward him, startled but not afraid. Their faces were pale in the headlights, eyes sharp alert. "You okay?" Daniel called, raising his voice over the rain. The one on the left nodded once. "Car died. Battery's gone. We tried calling for help." Or, "No signal," the other added, holding up the phone. Her voice was steady, but her shoulders were tight. Daniel nodded already, crouching near the hood. He popped it open and leaned in, rain dripping off his nose. He didn't need long. Corrosion on the terminals, old battery, dead in this weather. "It's not going anywhere tonight," he said, straightening. "You can call a tow when the storm eases." But that might be a while. They exchanged a glance. Not panic. Calculation. "We're fine waiting," the first said, then hesitated. "But we'd rather not." Daniel exhaled slowly. He hadn't planned this far. He glanced back at his car, at the empty passenger seat, at the clock on the dashboard glowing a little past 10. "There's a motel 15 minutes down," he said. "Not fancy. Dry. You can get a room and deal with the car in the morning." They looked at him more carefully then. His jacket, his hands, the old sedan idling behind him. "You don't have to," the second woman said. "We don't want to be a problem." Daniel almost laughed. "You're not." They loaded their bags into his trunk without complaint. The ride was quiet at first, rain hammering the roof, the heater rattling as it struggled to keep up. "I'm Daniel," he said finally. "Emily," said the woman in the front seat. "This is Grace." They didn't sound drunk. They didn't sound reckless. Just tired. Grace leaned forward slightly. "Thanks for stopping." Daniel shrugged. Didn't feel right not to. Emily studied the road ahead. Most people didn't. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to explain how many times he had been that person driving past. They talked a little after that. Small things, where they were headed, how the storm had come out of nowhere. Then Emily asked gently, "You have kids?" Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "A daughter. 7. Grace smiled faintly. "Lucky." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She keeps me honest." The motel's neon sign buzzed in the rain when they pulled in. Daniel parked beneath it, the light flickering red across the windshield. Emily reached for the door, then paused. "Hey," she said. "This might sound strange, but you seem like someone who shows up." Daniel frowned. "I try." Grace met his eyes in the rearview mirror. Our dad didn't. Not much. Daniel nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. He watched them hurry toward the lobby, then sat there a moment longer, rain streaking the glass. He drove home afterward, the road empty again. The storm beginning to break. Now back in the courthouse, that memory pressed against him as the recess dragged on. People milled about in hushed clusters. Laura spoke urgently with her attorney, her face tight controlled. Daniel sat alone, hands clasped, staring at the floor. His attorney leaned in. Once whispered something about procedure, about patience. Daniel barely heard him. What he heard was the judge's voice in his head. Calm. Measured, familiar somehow. When court resumed, a different judge took the bench. Judge Whitman did not return. A murmur rippled through the room as the clerk announced the change. Laura's attorney stiffened. Daniel's attorney blinked, surprised. The new judge was younger, broader, his expression less practiced. He reviewed the file quickly, nodding as the clerk summarized the reason for reassignment. Conflict of interest. Recusal. Daniel's heart thudded. The words made sense. They also didn't. His mind scrambled, replaying faces, voices, details he had dismissed as coincidence. The rain, the names, the way Judge Whitman had looked at him. The proceedings continued, but something fundamental had shifted. The air felt less predetermined. The arguments sounded different, now stripped of whatever unseen weight had hung over them before. When the court ordered a full evaluation, Daniel exhaled for the first time in hours. Not relief. Not yet. Just space. Weeks passed. Interviews. Home visits. Questions that cut and questions that comforted. Sophie answered them all with quiet seriousness, sitting at the kitchen table with her rabbit beside her. She talked about school, about how her dad read to her every night, even when he was tired, about how he burned pancakes but made the best eggs. Laura spoke too. Not cruelly, not falsely. She talked about worry, about wanting more for her daughter, about fear disguised as certainty. Daniel listened when he could. He kept his head down. He kept working. He showed up. On a clear afternoon. Months later, Daniel saw Emily and Grace again. It was at a community center fundraiser. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, a banner that sagged slightly at one end. They spotted him across the room and hesitated, then approached. Emily said. She smiled real this time. You look better. Daniel chuckled. Dry helps. Grace glanced around, then lowered her voice. Our dad wanted to say thank you. He won't, because that's who he is. But he knows. Daniel nodded slowly. I didn't do anything special. Emily shook her head. You did. You stopped. Daniel watched them walk away, blending into the crowd, and felt something settle in his chest. Not triumph, not fate. Just the quiet understanding that some nights matter more than you know, and some choices echo longer than the storm that forced them. The evaluation report arrived on a Tuesday, folded once, and slid halfway under Daniel's apartment door, like it didn't want to be seen. He stood there staring at it, keys still in his hand, rainwater dripping onto the thin carpet. The envelope was heavy, in a way paper shouldn't be. He bent, picked it up, and felt the weight settle into his palm. Inside were words that would be read aloud by people who had never fixed a leaking sink at midnight or counted quarters for gas. Words that would be used to define him. Daniel set the envelope on the kitchen table and didn't open it. He washed his hands instead. Soap. Water. The familiar routine steadied him. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor with her coloring book tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, concentrating. She looked up at him with a quick smile and went back to filling in the sky with blue. Mail, she asked. Yeah, Daniel said. Nothing exciting. She nodded, accepting it. She trusted him in a way that felt heavier than any accusation. The report stayed sealed until after dinner, until dishes were done, until Sophie was in her room, door half open, the nightlight humming softly. Daniel sat at the table and finally broke the seal. The paper whispered as it unfolded. He read slowly, eyes tracking each line, absorbing the tone more than the content. Balanced, careful, clinical. Primary caregiver, stable environment. Financial constraints noted. Emotional availability high. He paused there. Emotional availability. The phrase felt foreign and exact at the same time. He turned the page. Recommendations followed. Structured visitation, gradual adjustment, continued monitoring. Daniel exhaled. Not a victory. Not a loss. A corridor. His phone buzzed on the table. He flinched, then checked the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Mr. Harris, a man's voice said. Calm. Older. Familiar in an unsettling way. This is Thomas Whitman. Daniel closed his eyes. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls leaning in. Yes, Daniel said. I won't keep you, Whitman said. I shouldn't be calling strictly speaking, but I wanted to say something off the record and brief. Daniel said nothing. He could hear traffic outside, tires hissing on wet pavement. My daughters told me you were kind to them, Whitman continued. They told me you didn't ask questions. You didn't posture. You did what was needed and then you left. Daniel swallowed. Anyone would have. Whitman was quiet for a moment. That hasn't been my experience. The silence stretched. Daniel waited. I recused myself because it was the only correct thing to do, Whitman said. But that doesn't mean I stopped paying attention to the process, or to my own blind spots. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He felt tired down to the bone. I'm not looking for favors. I know, Whitman said. That's why this matters. The line went dead. Daniel sat there for a long time, phone still in his hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of Sophie turning a page in her room. He didn't know what the call meant. He only knew it had shifted something again, like pressure changing before weather. The next hearing came and went, with careful language and cautious faces. The judge read the report aloud. Laura listened, lips pressed together, eyes glossy but controlled. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood and spoke plainly. He talked about mornings, about homework, about missed sleep and earned trust. He did not beg. He did not perform. The ruling was measured. Temporary primary custody, expanded visitation, a date set for review. Outside the courthouse, Laura stopped him. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and old paper. She looked tired, older than he remembered. I'm not trying to hurt you, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. I know. She studied him for a second, then looked away. I just don't want her to struggle. She already does, Daniel said. We just don't call it that when it looks like love. Laura blinked. Then she nodded once and walked away. Life didn't change overnight. It rarely did. Daniel went back to work. He fixed cars that broke down at the worst times. He listened to customers complain about costs he couldn't control. He packed lunches. He learned which nights Sophie needed him to sit on the edge of the bed longer. Then the garage got quiet. It started with one missed shipment. Then another. The owner, Frank, stood in the doorway one morning with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. They're pulling contracts, Frank said. Big ones. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. Why, Frank shook his head. No idea. Corporate nonsense. The work dried up fast. Hours were cut. Overtime vanished. Daniel felt the familiar squeeze in his chest, the numbers recalculating themselves whether he wanted them to or not. He started picking up odd jobs, fixing fences, hauling scrap, anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions. One evening as he was loading tools back into his car, a black sedan pulled into the lot. It was clean in a way that suggested intention. Emily and Grace stepped out, coats, buttoned expressions, serious. We were hoping you'd still be here, Emily said. Daniel wiped rain from his brow. What's going on? Grace exchanged a look with her sister. Our father wants to talk. Not about the case, about the garage. Daniel frowned. I don't own it. No, Emily said. But you run it when it matters. They handed him a card. No title, just a name, an address. Daniel stared at it. I don't understand. You will, Grace said softly. The address led him downtown to a building he had passed 100 times without noticing. Glass, steel, quiet confidence. The lobby was empty, except for a woman at the desk, who looked up and smiled like she had been expecting him. Mr. Harris, she said. They're waiting. The room upstairs was not a courtroom. No bench, no flags, just a long table screens, dark chairs neatly arranged. Whitman stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned when Daniel entered. Thank you for coming, Whitman said. Daniel stayed standing. You said this wasn't about the case. It isn't, Whitman said. It's about what comes after. Whitman gestured to the table. Sit. Daniel did. His heart pounded. He felt the same sensation he had felt in the courtroom before the judge entered. The sense of something larger moving. Whitman took his seat. I spent years believing that the law was enough, he said. That if I applied it correctly, outcomes would be just. I ignored the systems that decide who gets to stand comfortably before the law, and who arrives already bent. Daniel listened wary. My daughters forced me to confront that Whitman continued, and so did you. He slid a folder across the table. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were documents, financials, contracts, names he didn't recognize, but understood in context. I chair a foundation, Whitman said. Public-facing philanthropic on paper. But it has influence. Quiet influence. We don't write checks for appearances. We invest in structures that last. Daniel looked up. Why me? Whitman met his gaze. Because you don't confuse help with control. Because you didn't ask who my daughters were. Because when pressure came, you didn't break. Daniel closed the folder. His pulse thundered. I'm not a symbol. No, Whitman said. You're a hinge. And hinges matter. Outside, the city hummed indifferent and alive. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him again. Not toward certainty, toward responsibility. He thought of Sophie, of the report on his table, of the garage doors closing. Tell me what this really is, Daniel said. Whitman smiled faintly. It's an opportunity. And a test. Daniel leaned back, breath-steadying eyes sharp now. He understood finally that the night he stopped on the highway had not ended when the rain did. It had only changed direction. Daniel did not sign anything that day. He left the building with the folder still closed under his arm, the city air colder than it had any right to be. Traffic moved around him in practiced indifference. People hurried past with phones pressed to their ears, faces tight with their own urgencies. Daniel walked 3 blocks before he realized his hands were shaking. He sat in his car and stared at the dashboard until the shaking stopped. Opportunity. Test. Whitman's words repeated themselves, calm and precise, like instructions that came without a manual. Daniel had spent his life reacting, fixing what broke, covering what leaked, making things work with what he had. This was different. This asked him to step forward, not just hold the line. At home, Sophie was at the table doing homework, her feet swinging beneath the chair. She looked up when he came in, eyes bright. You're late? Yeah, Daniel said. He hung his jacket slower than usual. Got caught up. She nodded, satisfied. Mrs. Keller says we might have a field trip. To the Science Museum. That's so. She grinned. She says parents can volunteer. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He smiled back. We'll see. After Sophie went to bed, Daniel opened the folder. The papers were dense but clear. A foundation. Shell companies that weren't shells at all. Investments in small-town infrastructure. Local businesses. Places like Frank's Garage. Places that didn't make headlines but kept people afloat. The numbers were large enough to scare him, spelled out in neat columns that suggested permanence. This wasn't charity. It was leverage. His phone buzzed. A text from Frank. Shops closed tomorrow. No work coming in. Daniel set the phone down and stared at the wall. He thought of Whitman's office, the way he had spoken about systems, about hinges. Daniel had never thought of himself as a turning point. He had thought of himself as a buffer, someone who absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Daniel dropped Sophie at school and drove past the garage without stopping. He went downtown instead to the address on the card Whitman's daughters had given him weeks earlier. A smaller building this time. Brick. A discreet sign. Inside, the receptionist greeted him by name without asking. The meeting room was already full. Men and women in plain clothes. No suits, no uniforms. Just professionals who carried themselves like they knew where the doors led. Whitman wasn't there. A woman in her 50s stood when Daniel entered. Mr. Harris, I'm Elaine Porter. She shook his hand firmly. Her grip was warm, steady. We've been reviewing your community. Daniel sat slowly. I didn't agree to anything. Elaine nodded. We know. This isn't a pitch. It's an explanation. She tapped a tablet and images appeared on the screen behind her. Maps, charts, a web of connections Daniel barely followed. Then it sharpened. The garage, the supply chain, a single distributor pulling out cascading consequences. This wasn't random, Elaine said. Contracts don't disappear by accident. Daniel leaned forward. Then why Elaine met his eyes. Because small places get squeezed first. Because they don't have lobbyists. Because when numbers tighten at the top, the pressure rolls downhill. And you can stop it, Daniel said. We can redirect it, she corrected. But not without someone on the ground. Someone who understands what breaks when support vanishes. Daniel felt a familiar anger stir. Controlled. Focused. You want me to be your face? Elaine shook her head. No. We want you to be our filter. She explained then. Slowly. Clearly. A pilot program. Quiet. Legal. Daniel would step into a leadership role, restructuring the garage, and others like it under a cooperative model. Ownership shared. Decision-making local. Backed by capital that didn't demand obedience, only accountability. And if I say no? Daniel asked. Elaine didn't hesitate. We find someone else. It will take longer. Some places won't survive the wait. Daniel thought of Frank, of the way his hands shook when he talked about losing contracts, of Sophie's field trip. I don't have a business degree, Daniel said. Elaine smiled slightly. Neither did most people who built anything that lasted. Daniel asked for time. Elaine gave him until Friday. That afternoon, Daniel went to the garage. The doors were half closed. Frank sat on a stool staring at an engine block like it had betrayed him. You here to say goodbye? Frank asked without looking up. Daniel leaned against the workbench, maybe to say something else. He told Frank what he could. Not names, not figures, just the shape of it. Support, change, risk. Frank listened in silence. When Daniel finished, Frank rubbed his face with both hands. You always did more than your share. I can't do this without you, Daniel said. Frank laughed softly. You already have. They talked until the light faded through the high windows. When Daniel left, the garage felt different. Not saved, but seen. Friday came faster than he expected. Daniel stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand, Elaine's number glowing on the screen. Sophie was eating cereal, humming to herself. He watched her for a moment, the way she held the spoon, the way she didn't look afraid. Daniel made the call. I'm in, he said when Elaine answered. But I won't be your shield. Elaine's voice was calm. Good. We already have one of those. The work began immediately. Meetings, calls, long nights with spreadsheets that made his eyes blur. Daniel learned quickly. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. He refused shortcuts that smelled like the ones he had been crushed by before. The resistance came quietly at first, suppliers dragging their feet, inspectors asking too many questions, a letter from a law firm warning him about interference. Daniel felt the old pressure building again, heavier now because more people stood behind him. One evening, as he locked up the garage, A black SUV idled across the street. The window rolled down. A man Daniel didn't recognize watched him with open curiosity. "Daniel Harris," the man said. It wasn't a question. "You're making waves." Daniel didn't answer. The man smiled thinly. "Be careful. Waves attract attention." The SUV pulled away. At home, Daniel found Sophie asleep on the couch, her homework spread out beside her. He picked her up carefully, carried her to bed. As he tucked the blanket around her shoulders, she stirred. "Daddy," she murmured. "Did you fix it?" Daniel paused. "I'm trying." She smiled already, drifting. "You always do." Daniel stood there longer than necessary, listening to her breathe. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He felt the weight of the week settle into him, not as fear, but as resolve. Whatever this had become, it was no longer just about custody. It was about pressure and who bent under it, about who got to decide which lives were expendable. Daniel turned off the light and closed the door gently. Somewhere beyond the walls of his small apartment, forces were aligning, watching him step into a space he hadn't known existed. And for the first time, Daniel Harris was not just reacting to the storm. He was standing where it formed. The first audit notice arrived without warning, folded crisply, and addressed to Daniel by name, as if whoever sent it wanted to be sure he understood this was no longer theoretical. He read it twice in the garage office, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead, suddenly too loud. Compliance review, regulatory inquiry, routine language sharpened into a blade by timing alone. He set the paper down and stared at the grease-stained desk, feeling the familiar instinct to brace, to shrink, to absorb the blow quietly, so no one else had to. Outside the garage sounded different these days. Not busy exactly, but alive. Doors opening, voices overlapping, tools clattering with purpose. Frank's laugh cut through it all, rough and surprised, like a man rediscovering a muscle he hadn't used in years. Daniel folded the notice and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't call Elaine right away. He walked the floor instead, stopping at each bay, checking in without checking out. People looked up when he passed, not deferential, aware. That awareness carried weight. By noon, the SUV was back. It parked across the street again, same spot, same angle, like a habit. Daniel noticed it through the open bay door as he tightened a bolt. He finished the job before wiping his hands and walking outside. The man from before stepped out, tall, neatly dressed shoes, too clean for the neighborhood. "You're consistent," the man said, smiling faintly. "I respect that." Daniel crossed his arms. "You stalking me?" The man chuckled. "Hardly. I represent parties who are curious. About what? About why a small garage in a declining corridor suddenly has liquidity." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Try the Chamber of Commerce." The man's smile thinned. "You're new at this." "Not really," Daniel said. "I've been underestimated longer than you've known my name." The man studied him, then nodded once. "This doesn't end the way you think." He walked back to the SUV and drove off. Daniel went inside and called Elaine. She listened without interrupting as he described the notice, the man, the questions. When he finished, there was a brief pause. "This was always coming," she said. "Pressure tests reveal fault lines. And if they find one, Daniel asked, then we reinforce, Elaine said, or we expose who created it. That afternoon, Sophie came to the garage after school. She sat at the small desk in the corner, coloring while Daniel worked through emails and documents. She looked up once, her brow furrowed. "You look tired," she said. Daniel smiled. "You always say that." She shrugged. "You always are." He laughed softly, then sobered. "You okay here?" She nodded. "I like it. It smells like oil and loud." He reached over and squeezed her shoulder, grounding himself in the simple solidity of her presence. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Not the custody review. This was different. City council, public comment, financial disclosures. Daniel stood at the podium in a borrowed blazer, the room packed with faces that reflected skepticism, hope, resentment, curiosity. All of it aimed at him. He spoke plainly about transparency, about local ownership, about why siphoning resources upward hollowed communities out until nothing remained but resentment and decay. He did not name enemies. He named patterns. A councilman leaned forward. "Mr. Harris, are you suggesting corruption?" Daniel met his gaze. "I'm suggesting incentives." The room murmured. Afterward, reporters clustered. Daniel answered a few questions, declined others. He didn't enjoy this part. He understood its necessity. That night, the call came. Daniel Whitman said, his voice steady. "You've crossed a line." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Sophie do homework. "I didn't draw it." "No." Whitman agreed. "You revealed it." Silence stretched between them. "You should know," Whitman continued, "there are people who believe this experiment of yours threatens more than a few contracts." "I figured," Daniel said. Whitman sighed. "I spent decades believing the law would restrain them. It rarely does without pressure." "Why tell me this?" Daniel asked. "Because pressure cuts both ways," Whitman said. "And because my daughters asked me to." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "They shouldn't be involved." "They already are," Whitman said. "So is your daughter, whether you like it or not." The line went dead. The next morning, the audit expanded. Emails flooded in. Requests multiplied. A supplier backed out without explanation. Frank slammed a wrench onto the bench, frustration cracking through his usual restraint. "They're trying to bleed us out," Frank said. Daniel nodded. Slowly. Elaine flew in that evening. She stood in the garage office jacket, draped over a chair, eyes sharp. "This is escalation," she said. "Which means we're effective." "Or exposed," Daniel replied. Elaine smiled grimly. "Same thing sometimes." They worked late, strategizing, shoring up documentation, preparing for public scrutiny. Daniel felt the old exhaustion creeping back heavier now, because it wasn't just his life on the line. It was dozens of others. At home, Sophie waited up for him. She sat on the couch, rabbit in her lap, eyes heavy but determined. "Are we okay?" she asked. Daniel knelt in front of her. He chose his words carefully. "We're in the middle of something." She nodded slowly. "Middle means not the end." He smiled. "That's right." The custody review came sooner than expected. New filings, new arguments. Laura's attorney pressed harder, citing instability, public attention risk. Daniel listened, hands folded, jaw set. When it was his turn, Daniel spoke again. Not defensively. Deliberately. He talked about Sophie's routine, her school, her resilience. He talked about change and how shielding children from it did not make them stronger. It made them afraid. The judge listened. The ruling came a week later. Custody affirmed. Conditions clarified. Stability recognized. Daniel exhaled the breath, leaving him in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The night after, he sat alone in the garage, lights off, listening to the building settle. He felt the weight of the months pressing down, not crushing him, but shaping him. He understood now that the kindness that had started this had been simple. The consequences were not. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. One sentence. "This isn't over." Daniel typed back without hesitation. "Neither am I." He put the phone down and stood, rolling his shoulders, stepping into the open bay where the night air met him head-on. Somewhere beyond the reach of the streetlights, systems shifted and recalculated. Daniel Harris stood at their edge, no longer invisible, no longer small, carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped running from storms and learned instead how to read their patterns. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, thick certified and addressed not to the garage, but to Daniel Harris personally, as if the sender wanted to make sure the pressure landed exactly where it was meant to. Daniel signed for it with a pen chained to the post office counter, the clerk watching him with mild curiosity. He didn't open it until he was back in his car. He didn't need to. He already knew what it was. Cease and desist. Allegations of undue influence. Claims that the cooperative restructuring violated competitive practices. Words chosen not to be proven, but to intimidate, to slow, to exhaust. Daniel folded the letter carefully and set it on the passenger seat. He drove to the garage in silence, the radio off the road, familiar in a way that no longer felt comforting. The building came into view. Doors open a truck halfway in. Frank bent over an engine with two of the younger mechanics. They looked up when Daniel pulled in. Not with fear, with expectation. Inside the office, Daniel laid the letter flat on the desk. Elaine was already there, coffee untouched, jacket still on. "They've moved it up," she said. "Federal level." Daniel nodded. "They always do." Elaine studied him. "You're calm." "I'm tired," Daniel said. "There's a difference." The days that followed blurred into each other. Meetings stacked on meetings. Lawyers who spoke in paragraphs that circled themselves. Emails that arrived late at night and early in the morning, always asking for one more document, one more clarification, one more concession. Daniel answered everything, slowly, precisely. He refused to rush. He refused to panic. Pressure didn't come only from above. It came sideways. A long-time supplier called to say their credit terms had changed. A landlord hinted at a lease review. A city inspector showed up twice in 1 week. Clipboard, pristine questions rehearsed. None of it was illegal. That was the point. At home, Sophie sensed it. She didn't ask questions. She started doing small things instead. Packing her backpack the night before. Turning off lights without being reminded. Sitting closer to Daniel on the couch, her head resting against his arm, like an anchor she hoped would hold. One night, as Daniel reviewed financial statements at the kitchen table, Sophie slid a piece of paper toward him. It was a drawing. The garage, the big doors, stick figures inside, smiling. Daniel recognized himself immediately, taller than everyone else, arms out, holding the roof up. "What's this?" he asked. Sophie shrugged. "It's you. Making sure it doesn't fall." Daniel swallowed. He set the paper beside the laptop and closed it. For the first time that week, he stopped working before midnight. The hearing was scheduled with less than a week's notice. Not a trial. Not yet. A preliminary review before a federal administrative panel. Windowless room. 3 officials. No jury. No gallery. Just fluorescent lights and quiet authority. Elaine laid out the strategy in clipped sentences. They want to paint you as reckless, idealistic, in over your head. Daniel nodded. Then we don't let them. You don't argue morality, she continued. You argue structure, process, precedent. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And if that's not enough, Elaine met his eyes. Then we remind them who benefits from things staying broken. The night before the hearing, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, listening to the building breathe. Pipes ticking. Distant sirens. Life continuing indifferent to paperwork and power plays. He thought of the highway again, of rain, of hazard lights blinking in the dark, of the moment he had chosen to stop without knowing why. That decision had felt small, almost invisible. Now it echoed in rooms he had never expected to enter. At dawn, he stood in the bathroom, tying his tie with steady hands. Sophie watched from the doorway. "You look like when you go to court," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's because I am." She stepped forward and hugged him around the waist, pressing her face into his shirt. "Don't forget," she said into the fabric. "You fix things." Daniel rested his hand on her back. "I will." The panel room smelled like disinfectant and old carpet. The officials sat behind a long table, faces neutral, eyes sharp. Daniel took his seat, spine straight, hands folded. The opposing counsel spoke first. Smooth, confident. They talked about market disruption, about unintended consequences, about how good intentions didn't excuse harm. They spoke as if Daniel were a concept, not a man. When it was his turn, Daniel stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He spoke like someone explaining a machine he had taken apart and put back together more times than he could count. He talked about supply chains, about how pressure traveled, about how small inefficiencies at the top translated into layoffs at the bottom. He described the cooperative model not as a rebellion, but as an adaptation, a response to forces that had already distorted the market beyond recognition. One of the panelists leaned forward. "Mr. Harris, are you claiming this is the only way?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm saying it's the way that keeps people employed without asking them to disappear." Silence followed. The questions came. Sharp, technical, designed to expose weakness. Daniel answered them all. When he didn't know something, he said so. When a mistake was pointed out, he acknowledged it and explained how it was being corrected. There was no drama in the room. No raised voices. No gavel. just the slow recalibration of assumptions. The decision did not come that day. Weeks passed. The pressure did not stop, but it changed. Less overt, more cautious. The SUV stopped appearing across the street. Suppliers began returning calls. The inspector stopped coming by. One afternoon, Elaine walked into the garage office with a thin smile. "They've backed off," she said. "Not fully, but enough." Daniel nodded, the relief settling in his chest like a warm weight. For now. For now, Elaine agreed. That evening, Daniel took Sophie out for ice cream. The small place on the corner with the cracked vinyl booths and the bell on the door. Sophie got chocolate with sprinkles. Daniel got vanilla. They sat by the window watching people pass. "Are you still in the middle?" Sophie asked, spoon hovering. Daniel considered it. "Yeah, but the middle's starting to look like something." She grinned. "Good, because middles mean you're going somewhere." Daniel laughed softly. He watched her eat the simple joy of it, grounding him. Outside, the sky was clear, no storm in sight. But Daniel knew better now than to believe calm meant safe. As they walked home, hand in hand, his phone buzzed. Elaine's name flashed on the screen. "Daniel," she said when he answered. "There's something you should know. This isn't just about the garage anymore." Daniel stopped walking. Sophie squeezed his hand, sensing the shift. "What is it about?" he asked. Elaine exhaled. "It's about who gets to decide what survives." Daniel looked down at Sophie, at the quiet street, at the buildings that had stood for decades because people had kept them standing. Then Daniel said, his voice steady, "They picked the wrong person to scare." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking, the weight of everything he had become settling around him, not as armor, but as purpose. The first call came before sunrise, sharp enough to pull Daniel out of a dream he couldn't remember. "Turn on the news," Elaine said. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice carried a tension he hadn't heard before. Local, not cable. Daniel moved through the apartment quietly, careful not to wake Sophie. The television flickered on volume low. A familiar anchor sat rigid behind the desk, words marching across the screen beneath her. Regional supplier under investigation. Allegations of price fixing and coercive contracts. Daniel felt the floor steady beneath his feet in a way that felt unreal. The name followed, a company he knew too well now. The same distributor that had pulled contracts, tightened credit, whispered threats through intermediaries who never left fingerprints. Elaine's voice came again. They didn't back off. They shifted. "For how long?" Daniel asked. "Long enough to hurt the right people," she said. "They're sacrificing a limb to save the body." Daniel turned the volume down and leaned against the counter. The kettle clicked on, automatically, muscle memory, moving him through the morning. "What do they want from us?" A pause. "They want you loud," Elaine said, "so they can call you reckless." Daniel watched steam curl from the kettle. "Then we don't give it to them." Sophie padded into the kitchen in socks, hair, wild eyes, half closed. "Why is the TV talking so early?" Daniel smiled and poured water into a mug. "Sometimes grown-ups forget to sleep." She climbed onto a chair and peered at the screen. "Is that bad news?" "Not yet," Daniel said. "Just complicated." She accepted that and began eating cereal, spoon clinking softly. Daniel watched her grounding himself again in the ordinary weight of a morning. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He didn't answer. By mid-morning, the garage was full in a way that felt different. Not busy. Alert. Frank stood near the office door, arms crossed, watching a group of men in suits move through the bays with polite interest and cold eyes. Clipboards. Questions that pretended to be curious. Daniel walked out to meet them. Daniel Harris, one of the men said, offering a hand. We're here to observe. Daniel shook it. Observe what operations, the man said. Community impact. Daniel nodded. You'll find plenty of both. They followed him through the space. Daniel didn't rush. He didn't slow down. He explained processes. He answered questions. When one of them asked about funding, Daniel gave them the structure. Cooperative, transparent, audited. And the foundation, another asked. Daniel met his gaze. Is public record. The man smiled faintly. Everything is. After they left, Frank exhaled. That felt like a warning. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. It was. By afternoon, the phones wouldn't stop. Reporters now. The story had legs. Price fixing. Community resistance. A blue-collar garage becoming a pressure point in a larger narrative. Elaine called again. They're pushing for a public hearing. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. City level or state? Both, she said. They want daylight. Daniel thought of the panel room, of fluorescent lights and neutral faces. He thought of Sophie's drawing of himself holding the roof up. Then we give it to them, he said. The hearing was scheduled fast, faster than anything else had been. A packed chamber, council members lining the dais, cameras wedged into corners, citizens filling every seat and standing along the walls. The air buzzed with heat and expectation. Daniel stood at the podium again, blazer hanging right tie straight. He scanned the room and saw faces he recognized. Mechanics, shop owners, teachers, people who had learned to read pressure the hard way. Opposing counsel spoke first. They painted a picture of chaos, of unintended consequences, of a man who had stumbled into power he didn't understand. When it was Daniel's turn, the room quieted. He didn't start with the garage. He started with numbers, not slogans, not outrage. He spoke about margins shrinking upstream, about consolidation, about how competition died quietly when choice became an illusion. He described how contracts were structured to look fair while bleeding smaller operators dry. One councilwoman leaned forward. Are you accusing specific companies? Daniel shook his head. I'm describing a system. Names don't matter if the mechanism stays intact. A murmur rippled through the room. And your solution? Another asked. Daniel took a breath. He felt it then. The shift. The attention settling not on his clothes or his accent or his background, but on his words. My solution isn't new, he said. It's old. Shared ownership. Local accountability. Capital that answers to people instead of extracting from them. A man in the back laughed derisively. Daniel didn't look at him. You think that's radical? Daniel continued. It built this country. We just forgot how to protect it. The room went still. Then a voice cut through it. Calm. measured, familiar. "I'd like to speak." Daniel turned. Judge Thomas Whitman stood near the side wall. No robe, no authority visible, except the kind that came from presence alone. The room stirred. Council members exchanged glances. Whitman stepped forward. "I'm here as a citizen," he said, "and as someone who has spent decades adjudicating disputes born from economic pressure." He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't need to. "I've watched cases where legality masked harm," Whitman said, "where compliance became a shield for exploitation. Mr. Harris's model does not threaten competition. It exposes the lack of it." Opposing counsel stood. "Your Honor, with respect." Whitman raised a hand. "I'm not here in that capacity." He turned to the council. "You can choose to protect the appearance of order, or you can choose to protect the people who keep your districts alive. One of these choices is harder. Both will be judged." He stepped back. The room held its breath. Questions followed. Tougher now, sharper. Daniel answered them all. He did not flinch. He did not overreach. He stayed where the truth held. When the hearing adjourned, there was no applause. No victory. Just a low hum of something changing shape. Outside, reporters surged. Daniel answered a few, declined others. Elaine stood at his side, eyes watchful. As the crowd thinned, a man approached Daniel quietly. Not the SUV man. Older, better dressed, smile practiced. "You made your point," the man said. "But this ends when you let it." Daniel met his gaze. "It ends when the pressure stops traveling downhill." The man's smile faded. "You're not as small as you look." Daniel smiled back, thin and calm. "Neither are you." That night, Daniel sat on the couch with Sophie. The television muted. She leaned against him, head on his shoulder. "Did you talk in the big room?" she asked. "I did," Daniel said. "Were you scared?" Daniel thought about the cameras, the questions, the weight. "I was focused." She nodded, satisfied. "Focused is good." Daniel kissed the top of her head and watched the city lights blink on outside the window. Somewhere, decisions were being reconsidered. Somewhere else, lines were being redrawn. He didn't know how this would end. He only knew that the story had grown beyond him now, and for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss of control. It felt like the beginning of accountability. The vote did not come that night or the next, and the waiting stretched in a way Daniel had learned to recognize as another form of pressure. Silence became the tactic. No calls, no notices, no inspectors wandering through the garage. The phones rang less, then more, then less again. A rhythm meant to keep him off balance. Daniel refused to chase it. He opened the doors at the same hour every morning. He closed them at the same hour every night. He kept the work moving. The story kept moving too. A regional paper ran a long piece that didn't use his name until the third paragraph. It talked about supply chains and rural labor and the quiet math of survival. It quoted shop owners, not Daniel. It ended with a question instead of a conclusion. By noon, the link had traveled farther than Daniel expected. By evening, it had reached places that never pretended to care about garages. Elaine came by with coffee and numbers. "They're circling," she said. "Different angle now." Daniel glanced up from a ledger. "Which one reputation?" Elaine said. "They're digging for a narrative that sticks." Daniel nodded. "They won't find one." Elaine's mouth tightened. "They'll find something adjacent." "They always do." It came 2 days later, late afternoon, when the sun slanted low and the garage smelled like warm metal. A woman stepped out of a car Daniel didn't recognize and walked toward him with a practiced smile. "Daniel Harris?" she asked, holding up a press badge. He wiped his hands and nodded. "What can I help you with?" "I'm working on a profile," she said. "Your rise is interesting." Daniel met her eyes. "I didn't rise." She smiled wider. "That's what makes it interesting." They talked by the bay door, the noise of the shop steady behind them. She asked about his childhood, his work, his custody case. She asked about the foundation without naming it. She asked about Whitman carefully. Daniel answered what he could. He declined what he should. When she asked him if he thought he was changing the system, he paused. "I think I'm responding to it," he said. "Change is what happens when responses add up." She nodded, scribbling. "And if this all falls apart?" Daniel shrugged. "Then people will still need their cars fixed." The article ran the next morning. It was fair, mostly. It framed him as reluctant, as a mechanic who had wandered into policy by necessity. It also mentioned the audit, the hearing, the growing scrutiny. The comments were less restrained. Some called him a hero, others called him a pawn. A few accused him of hiding something bigger. Daniel read none of it. Frank did, and stopped after 10 minutes. "You can't win them all," Frank said. Daniel didn't answer. He was watching Sophie through the office window, coloring on the floor again. Her rabbit balanced on the desk chair, like it was supervising. He wondered what stories would reach her school. He wondered how long before someone tried to use that. That night, Daniel received an invitation. Thick paper, clean print, a private dinner, no address listed. Just a time and a phone number. Elaine read it twice. "They want to size you up." Daniel looked at the card. "Who's they?" Elaine didn't smile. "The people who don't like surprises." He went. The address turned out to be a restaurant Daniel had driven past without ever noticing. No sign. Just a door and a man who nodded when Daniel gave his name. The room inside was dim and quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested control, not intimacy. 3 people waited at the table. 2 men, 1 woman, all older, all composed. Their clothes were expensive in a way that didn't need labels. "Mr. Harris," the woman said, standing. "Thank you for coming." Daniel shook her hand. "I'm curious," good one of the men said. Curiosity keeps people flexible. They spoke over dinner, never raising their voices, never naming names. They talked about markets and margins and unintended consequences. They talked about stability like it was a virtue independent of fairness. "You've created volatility," the second man said gently, "whether you intended to or not." Daniel set his fork down. Volatility already existed. I just stopped absorbing it. The woman leaned back. "You're forcing a conversation that doesn't benefit everyone." Daniel met her gaze. Conversations don't have to. They watched him carefully then. The way he ate. The way he listened. the way he didn't fill silences. "What do you want?" the first man asked finally. Daniel smiled faintly. "I want to keep fixing things." The man frowned. "That's not an answer." "It is," Daniel said. "It's just not transactional." They ended the dinner without agreement, without threat, without warmth. Daniel walked out into the night, feeling neither relieved nor afraid, just certain that he had been measured and found inconvenient. At home, Sophie was asleep on the couch again, the television paused on a cartoon. Daniel carried her to bed, feeling the familiar weight of her in his arms. She stirred and murmured something he couldn't quite catch. In the quiet, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He didn't look at comments. He looked at structures, at spreadsheets, at the quiet math that told him where pressure would go next. His phone buzzed. A message from Elaine. One line. "They're calling for a closed session tomorrow." Daniel typed back. "I'll be there." The session took place in a room without windows. City officials, state representatives, legal counsel. No cameras, no public comment. Daniel took his seat and waited. They spoke for an hour before anyone addressed him directly. When they did, it was the woman from dinner. "You're becoming a focal point," she said. "Focal points attract stress." Daniel nodded. "That's physics." A man across the table tapped his pen. "You could step back. Let this settle." "And what happens to the garages?" Daniel asked. The man shrugged. "Market forces." Daniel leaned forward. "Market forces don't show up for parent-teacher conferences." The room stilled. "You're personalizing this," the woman said. "I'm contextualizing it," Daniel replied. The discussion went in circles after that. Carefully, respectfully. Nothing was decided. Everything was noted. When Daniel left, the sun was already down. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it, feeling the weight of the day settle into him like a coat he had learned to wear. At home, Sophie waited up. "Did you win?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Not yet." She considered this. "Are you losing?" Daniel shook his head. "No," she nodded, satisfied. "Then you're still playing?" Daniel laughed softly and pulled her into a hug. He felt the quiet resolve settle deeper, not sharp, not loud, just present. Somewhere beyond his sight, the system was recalibrating, deciding whether to bend or break. Daniel Harris went to bed, knowing one thing with absolute clarity. The story was no longer about whether he belonged in rooms like that. It was about whether those rooms could withstand what he was bringing into them. The injunction came at dawn, not shouted from headlines, but delivered quietly through legal channels that preferred efficiency over spectacle. Elaine called first. They filed it overnight, temporary, narrow, but strategic. Daniel was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold. Sophie slept down the hall, the apartment wrapped in that fragile, early morning stillness that made everything feel provisional. "What does it stop?" Daniel asked. Elaine exhaled. "Expansion. New cooperatives. New capital flow. They're trying to freeze you in place." Daniel nodded slowly. "And the existing shops?" "Still operating," she said. "For now." He stood and looked out the window. The street below was empty, wet from a light rain that had passed before sunrise. Then we hold. By 8, the phones were ringing again. Shop owners asking what it meant. Mechanics worried about paychecks. Local reporters circling eager for a clean narrative. Daniel answered who he could then handed the rest to Elaine. He didn't want confusion. He wanted clarity. At the garage, Frank paced. "They're trying to starve us," Frank said, voice tight. "Bleed us slow." Daniel leaned against the workbench. "They're trying to see who panics." Frank stopped. And we don't." The day unfolded in layers. Lawyers, conference calls. A statement drafted and redrafted until it said exactly what it needed and nothing more. Daniel insisted on one line staying in. No layoffs planned. Frank read it twice and nodded. By afternoon, the injunction was public. Headlines softened it into something palatable. Legal challenge halts controversial restructuring. Words that made it sound temporary. Contained. It wasn't. Elaine arrived with a stack of documents and a look that told Daniel this was the moment she had been preparing him for since the first meeting. "They want a fight that drains you." Daniel flipped through the papers. "Then we change the terrain." She raised an eyebrow. How Daniel closed the folder. "We stop being the only example." That night, Daniel drove to a town an hour away. Smaller. Quieter. He parked behind a diner with flickering lights and walked inside, nodding at the waitress who recognized him from the article. A group waited in a back booth. Shop owners. A parts supplier. A retired accountant who had volunteered his time. They looked at Daniel with cautious hope. "I can't promise you protection," Daniel said, once coffee had been poured. "I can promise you transparency." They listened, asked questions, pushed back where they should. By the time Daniel left, there were no signatures, just understanding. The next morning, the first letter arrived. Then another. Interest. Curiosity. Not commitment. Yet. At home, Sophie sensed the shift again. She sat on the couch with her rabbit and watched Daniel pace. "You're thinking loud," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Sorry." She considered him. "Is it the big people again?" "Some of them." She nodded. "Big doesn't mean right." Daniel knelt in front of her. "No, it doesn't." The pressure escalated 2 days later. A supplier cancelled outright. No explanation. No apology. Frank threw a rag across the shop and swore under his breath. Daniel listened. Didn't interrupt. That afternoon, a notice appeared on Daniel's phone. Emergency meeting. State level. Closed session. Elaine met him outside the building, her face composed but tight. "They're moving fast." Inside the room was larger than the others had been. Higher ceiling, more distance between seats. The woman from the private dinner sat near the center. The men flanked her. They all looked rested. "You're testing boundaries," the woman said, as Daniel took his seat. Daniel met her gaze. "So are you." She smiled thinly. "You're encouraging duplication." Daniel nodded. "Resilience. Call it what you like," she said. "It complicates oversight." Daniel leaned forward. Oversight or control? A murmur moved through the room. One of the men spoke. "This can end cleanly." Daniel waited. You step back, the man continued. Publicly. Let this be studied, regulated, absorbed, and the people Daniel asked. The man shrugged. Markets adjust. Daniel sat back. I grew up adjusting. Silence followed. Not hostile, calculating. You don't understand the scale, the woman said. This isn't about a garage. Daniel nodded. I know. She watched him closely then. What are you really after? Daniel thought of the highway. The hazard lights, the moment of stopping without knowing why. He thought of Sophie's drawing, of himself holding the roof. I'm after balance, he said. And I'm patient. The meeting ended without resolution. Outside, Elaine walked beside him in silence until they reached the steps. They underestimated you, she said, finally. Daniel exhaled. They still are. That night, the first cooperative outside Daniel's direct involvement announced itself. A joint statement. Shared ownership. No foundation named. No Daniel Harris mentioned. The story spread quietly. Faster than headlines, through calls and emails and conversations over coffee. Daniel watched it happen without touching it. At the garage, work continued, reduced, tighter, but steady. Then the custody notice arrived. Laura had filed a motion. Emergency. Citing instability. Public scrutiny. Risk to Sophie. Daniel read it once and set it down. The familiar anger stirred sharp but controlled. He called his attorney. We respond, Daniel said. Calmly. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Daniel didn't tell Sophie right away. He waited until Sunday afternoon, when they sat at the park watching leaves fall. There might be another meeting with the judge, Daniel said carefully. Sophie swung her legs. Like before. Yes. She looked at him, eyes serious. Are you still fixing things? Daniel smiled. I am. She nodded, satisfied. The hearing was shorter than Daniel expected. The judge listened, asked questions, reviewed filings. Laura spoke. Not cruelly. Fearfully. When it was Daniel's turn, he spoke about routine, about school, about showing up, about how change didn't have to mean danger. The judge took it under advisement. Outside, rain began again. Not heavy. Persistent. That evening, Daniel received a message from an unknown number. We need to talk. No lawyers. Daniel stared at it, then typed back. If it's about control, no. A pause. Then a reply. It's about stopping collateral damage. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought of the spreading cooperatives, of the injunction, of Sophie asleep in her room. He typed one word. Where? The reply came immediately. Tomorrow. Same restaurant. Daniel set the phone down and sat in the quiet, the weight of the moment settling around him. The system was tightening, but it was also revealing its seams. He knew now that the end of this chapter would not look like a victory or a defeat. It would look like a choice. And Daniel Harris had learned the hard way that the choices you make when the pressure peaks are the ones that write the story long after the noise fades. The restaurant looked the same in daylight, which made Daniel uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain. No sign. No valet. just a door that opened when you knocked once and waited. He arrived early, sat at the same table, ordered black coffee he didn't touch. Outside, traffic moved at an ordinary pace, unaware of the small collision about to happen inside. They came together this time, the woman first, composed as ever. One of the men followed. The other seat stayed empty. "We don't have much time," the woman said, sitting. "Things are accelerating." Daniel nodded. "They always do at the end." She studied him not unkindly. "You've forced a reckoning." "I didn't force it," Daniel said. "I stopped absorbing it." The man cleared his throat. "The injunction will stand for now. But enforcement is becoming complicated." Daniel waited. "Your model is replicating faster than we anticipated." The woman continued. "Without your name, without our involvement. It's creating pressure we can't localize." Daniel took a slow breath. That was the point. She leaned forward. "We're offering a resolution." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "You're offering containment." She didn't deny it. "Call it stabilization." "And the cooperatives?" Daniel asked. "They remain," the man said, "under stricter oversight, slower growth. And my role?" The woman held his gaze. "You step back publicly. You return to being what you were." Daniel smiled faintly. "You mean invisible?" "Safe," she corrected. Daniel shook his head once. "Safe for who?" Silence settled between them. Not tense. Final. "You don't understand what happens if this continues," the man said. "Capital moves, jobs disappear." Daniel looked at him steadily. "They already did. I just stopped pretending it was natural." The woman sighed. "Then we'll proceed without your cooperation." Daniel stood. "You already are." He left without shaking hands. Outside, the air felt cleaner than it had in weeks. Not lighter. Clearer. That afternoon, the custody ruling came through. Primary custody affirmed. Conditions unchanged. No emergency found. Daniel read it once, then folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't call anyone right away. He drove to the garage instead. Frank was under a truck, feet sticking out. "You hear he called?" Daniel nodded. "I did." Frank slid out and sat up, wiping his hands. "Good." They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. The injunction expired quietly 2 weeks later. No announcement, no reversal. Just a notice buried under other notices, its language softened, its scope narrowed until it no longer bit. By then it hardly mattered. The cooperatives were operating, independently, locally, not perfectly, but honestly. The pressure shifted again, not gone, redirected. Systems didn't collapse, they adapted. Some resisted longer than others. A few broke. Daniel stayed where he was. He turned down interviews. He declined panels. He let others speak. He fixed cars. He taught younger mechanics how to read contracts the way they read engines. He learned how to listen when listening mattered more than leading. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Emily and Grace stopped by the garage. No cameras, no ceremony. "Our dad wanted us to tell you something," Grace said. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to." Emily smiled. "We know. That's why we did." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a single sheet, typed, unadorned, resigned, effective immediately. No explanation. No signature flourish. Daniel read it twice, then folded it carefully. He didn't do this for me. Grace shook her head. He did it because he finally understood what it costs not to. Daniel nodded slowly. That night he walked home with Sophie. The streetlights blinked on one by one. She skipped ahead, then waited for him to catch up. "You're smiling," she said. Daniel laughed softly. "I am. Is everything fixed?" Daniel thought about that. About systems, about people, about storms that never really stopped, only changed shape. Not everything he said, but enough. She took his hand. Enough is good. At home, Daniel taped Sophie's old drawing to the fridge, the one where he held the roof up. He stood back and looked at it, feeling something settle that he hadn't known was loose. Later, when the apartment was quiet, Daniel sat by the window and watched the city breathe. He understood now that power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited in plain sight, underestimated until someone chose not to look away. The night he stopped on the highway had not saved the world. It had saved his integrity. Everything else had followed. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Write these 3 words, "Only I was there,"